Hello? I'm Rachel. 3 weeks ago, my mother stood in front of 50 people at my sister's engagement celebration and called me worthless. She said I was a drain on the family, a disappointment who couldn't hold down a decent job, and that she was embarrassed to call me her daughter. The entire room fell silent as she delivered what felt like a public execution of my character. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that tucked inside my purse was an FBI badge that told a completely different story. A badge that represented 3 years of undercover work that had just dismantled the largest human trafficking ring in the Pacific Northwest. A badge that came with a commendation letter signed by the director himself, praising work that would never make headlines because that's how deep cover operations work. But here's the thing about being underestimated by the people who are supposed to love you most. Sometimes it becomes your greatest advantage. Sometimes it becomes the very thing that allows you to do work that actually matters while they're busy judging what they think they see. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The rain was coming down in sheets when I pulled into the parking lot of the Emerald Bay Resort just outside Seattle. October in Washington meant the kind of weather that soaked through your jacket in seconds, and I sat in my car for a moment, watching the windshield wipers fight a losing battle against the downpour. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary as I stared at the elegant building rising in front of me, all glass and timber and expensive lighting that seemed to mock the modest Honda I was driving. This was it. My sister Emma's engagement party. The celebration that had been planned for months. The event that Mom had been talking about nonstop since Emma announced her engagement to David. A successful surgeon who came from the kind of family that belonged to country clubs and took vacations in the Hamptons. The kind of family that would fit perfectly with ours. Or at least with the version of our family that existed when I wasn't around to complicate the narrative. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror one more time. My dark hair was pulled, back in a simple bun, and I was wearing the same navy dress I'd worn to my college graduation 4 years ago. It was professional, modest, and completely unremarkable. Which was exactly how I needed to look, even though tonight I wasn't working. Even though tonight I was supposed to be just Emma's sister, just Mom's other daughter, just Rachel who never quite measured up to the standards everyone else seemed to achieve effortlessly. The irony wasn't lost on me that maintaining my cover had become so automatic that even at family events, I dressed like someone trying not to be noticed. Someone trying not to draw attention. Someone whose presence was more obligation than celebration. I grabbed my small black purse from the passenger seat, feeling the weight of what was inside. My credentials were there, tucked safely in the interior pocket, the gold badge that represented everything my family couldn't see and wouldn't understand. Special Agent Rachel Marie Chen, it read, though I'd been using the name Rachel Collins for the past 18 months while working a case that had consumed every waking moment and quite a few sleeping ones too. The resort's lobby was exactly what I expected. Marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and the kind of understated elegance that whispered wealth rather than shouting it. A hostess in a sleek black dress directed me toward the private dining room, where the party was being held, her smile professional but distant. I could hear laughter and conversations spilling out from behind closed doors, the sound of people who belonged together, who shared the same language of success and social status that had always felt foreign to me. I paused outside the door, taking a deep breath that had nothing to do with nerves and everything to do with preparation. This wasn't my first time walking into a room where I didn't belong. The difference was that in my professional life, that was the point. I was supposed to be the person who blended into backgrounds, who became invisible until the moment I needed to be seen. Tonight, though, the invisibility felt different. Tonight, it felt personal. The room was beautiful, I had to admit. Floor to ceiling windows looked out over Elliott Bay, though the storm outside made the view more dramatic than picturesque. Round tables draped in cream linens filled the space, each one topped with arrangements of white peonies and eucalyptus that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in a month. The lighting was soft and warm, casting everything in a golden glow that made everyone look like they belonged in a magazine spread about successful families celebrating life's perfect moments. Emma was holding court near the far end of the room, radiant in a champagne-colored dress that probably had a designer label I wouldn't recognize. Her auburn hair cascaded in loose waves over her shoulders, and her engagement ring caught the light every time she gestured, which she was doing frequently. As she told some story that had her small audience laughing appreciatively, she looked happy, genuinely happy, in a way that made something tight in my chest loosen slightly. Whatever else happened tonight, Emma deserved this happiness. David stood beside her with his arm around her waist, looking every inch the successful doctor he was. Tall, conventionally handsome, with the kind of confident smile that suggested he'd never doubted his place in the world or his right to be in any room he entered. He was good for Emma, I could see that. He looked at her like she was the most fascinating person he'd ever met, and that was exactly what my sister deserved. Mom was circulating through the crowd like she was running for office, air kissing friends, and introducing people who probably already knew each other. She wore a burgundy dress that complemented her silver hair perfectly, and diamond earrings that caught the light when she tilted her head to listen to someone's response to whatever question she was asking. She was in her element, the proud mother hosting a celebration for her successful daughter who was marrying well and making all the right choices. I looked around for my assigned seat and felt a familiar sinking sensation when I spotted the place card with my name at a table near the back corner, close to the service entrance where the waitstaff came and went. Table 8, next to David's. Cousin visiting from Portland, and someone's +1 who apparently didn't know anyone else at the party. The geography of the room told the story clearly. The important people, the family members who mattered, the friends worth showcasing, they were all seated near Emma and David at the front. The rest of us were relegated to the periphery, close enough to witness the celebration, but far enough away to avoid disrupting it. I made my way to the table, nodding politely to the other occupants who looked as out of place as I felt. David's cousin turned out to be a soft-spoken woman named Lisa, who worked as a librarian and seemed relieved to find someone else who wasn't eager to network or make small talk about career achievements. The +1 was a man in his 70s whose granddaughter was Emma's college roommate, and he spent most of the cocktail hour showing me pictures of his garden back in Spokane. It was comfortable, actually, sitting with people who weren't trying to impress anyone or prove anything. Lisa and I talked about books, and Mr. Peterson told stories about teaching high school biology for 40 years that were genuinely funny and, surprisingly, touching. For a few minutes, I almost forgot that I was supposed to feel inadequate here, that my presence was meant to highlight everything I wasn't accomplishing compared to everyone else in the room. Then Mom approached the microphone that had been set up near the head table, and the comfortable anonymity of Table 8 suddenly felt more like isolation. She tapped the microphone gently, and the conversations around the room gradually died down as people turned their attention toward her. Emma beamed from her seat, David's hand covering hers on the table, and I felt that complicated mix of love and distance that had characterized my relationship with my family for as long as I could remember. Mom began by thanking everyone for coming, her voice carrying easily through the room with the kind of confidence that comes from years of practice at public speaking. She talked about how proud she was of Emma, how thrilled the family was about the engagement, how wonderful it was to see Emma with someone who appreciated her intelligence and ambition and supported her goals. Then she started talking about Emma specifically, about her accomplishments and her bright future. Emma had graduated summa cum laude from the University of Washington with a degree in marketing, she told the room. Emma had been promoted twice, in the 3 years since graduation, and was now managing major accounts at one of Seattle's most prestigious advertising agencies. Emma was planning to continue her career after marriage because she was the kind of modern woman who could balance everything successfully. The pride in Mom's voice was unmistakable, and I found myself smiling despite the growing knot in my stomach. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Emma deserved every word of praise. She was brilliant and hardworking and had built a career she could be proud of. She had found love with someone who valued her for who she was, rather than trying to change her into someone else. She was living the kind of life that looked perfect from the outside and actually seemed to be pretty wonderful from the inside, too. But then Mom's tone shifted slightly, and I felt the familiar tightening in my chest that came whenever I sensed one of her passive-aggressive pivots approaching. She talked about how blessed she felt to have one daughter who had found her path so clearly, who had never wavered in her commitment to building a successful life. She talked about how proud she was to have a daughter who had made choices that reflected well on the family, who had found a partner who shared their values and their vision for the future. And then she looked directly at me. The room was quiet, expectant, and I could feel eyes turning in my direction as Mom continued speaking. Her smile never wavered, but there was something sharp underneath it, something that suggested this moment had been planned rather than spontaneous. She talked about how different children find their way at different paces, how some people are early bloomers while others take longer to figure out what they want from life. She mentioned how challenging it could be for parents when one child seemed to struggle with direction, when one child couldn't seem to settle into the kind of stable, respectable career that parents could point to with pride. The words weren't cruel exactly. They were wrapped in the language of concern and maternal love. But everyone in the room understood what was really being said. Everyone understood that while Emma represented success and family pride, I represented something else entirely. Disappointment, maybe, or confusion about how two children raised in the same house could turn out so differently. I sat very still, my hands folded in my lap, while Mom continued what had essentially become a public comparison between her two daughters. I was aware of Lisa beside me shifting uncomfortably, of Mr. Peterson studying his hands, of the way conversations at nearby tables had stopped entirely as people tried to process what they were witnessing. Mom wrapped up by saying she was confident that everyone would find their path eventually, that she had faith that all her children would ultimately make choices that reflected the values they'd been raised with. But the damage was done. The key message was clear. Tonight was about celebrating Emma's success, and by extension, it was about highlighting everything I hadn't achieved. When she finished speaking and raised her glass for a toast to Emma and David, I lifted my water glass and smiled, because that's what you do at family celebrations. You smile and you participate, and you pretend that being publicly diminished by your own mother is just another part of the evening's entertainment. But as I sat there listening to the applause and watching Emma laugh at something David whispered in her ear, I thought about the case files sitting on my desk back in Seattle. I thought about the 3 young women who were alive and safe tonight. Because of work I'd done over the past year and a half, work that had required me to become someone else entirely in order to get close to people who trafficked human beings like they were commodities to be bought and sold. I thought about the testimony I'd given in federal court just 2 weeks ago. Testimony that would help put away men who had stolen childhoods and destroyed lives and operated with impunity for years because they thought no one was watching closely enough to stop them. I thought about the commendation letter I'd received from the director, praising work that would never be public knowledge, because that's how undercover operations function. The criminals were caught, the victims were safe, and the agents who made it happen remained shadows in the official record. Mom saw an unemployed daughter who couldn't get her life together. She saw someone who lived in a small apartment and drove an old car and never seemed to have exciting news to share at family gatherings. She saw failure where she expected success, disappointment where she hoped for pride. What she didn't see was the woman who had spent 18 months building relationships with monsters in order to bring them down. What she didn't see was the agent who had earned the trust of terrified victims and helped them find the courage to testify against their captors. What she didn't see was the professional who had contributed to work that would prevent countless other families from experiencing the kind of loss that had motivated me to join law enforcement in the first place. As the evening continued and people returned to their conversations and their celebration, I excused myself from the table and walked toward the restrooms, needing a few minutes away from the performance of Family Harmony. But instead of going inside, I stepped through a side door that led to a covered patio overlooking the water. The storm had softened to a steady drizzle, and the air was cool and clean in a way that helped clear my head. I pulled out my phone and saw 3 missed calls from my supervisor, Agent Martinez, and a text that simply said, "Call me when you can. We have a situation." Even at my sister's engagement party, even on what was supposed to be a night off, the work followed me. Because that's what happens when you're part of something bigger than yourself, when you're contributing to efforts that can't pause for family celebrations or personal convenience. I was about to call Martinez back when I heard footsteps behind me and turned to find Emma approaching, her champagne flute in hand and a concerned expression on her face. We stood there for a moment, sisters separated by more than just the few feet of covered patio between us, and I waited to see what she would say about Mom's speech, about the way I'd been positioned as the family's cautionary tale in front of 50 people who were supposed to be celebrating her happiness. But Emma surprised me. Instead of offering empty reassurance or making excuses for Mom's behavior, she said quietly, "I know there's more to your story than what people see. I don't know what it is, but I know you're not who Mom thinks you are." And for the first time that evening, I felt like someone in my family was actually seeing me, even if they couldn't see the whole truth. Emma's words hung in the air between us like a bridge I wasn't sure I could cross. The rain continued its gentle rhythm on the covered patio roof, and somewhere inside the celebration continued without us, the sound of laughter and clinking glasses drifting through the glass doors. I studied my sister's face in the dim lighting, looking for signs of the judgment I'd grown accustomed to, but finding instead something that looked like genuine concern. "What makes you say that?" I asked carefully, my training kicking in even with family. Never reveal more than necessary, never confirm what hasn't been directly stated, always leave room to retreat if the conversation takes an unexpected turn. Emma took a sip of her champagne and leaned against the patio railing, her engagement ring catching what little light filtered through the storm clouds. "Because I pay attention, Rachel. I notice things that Mom doesn't bother to see. Like how you always have money for emergencies, even though you supposedly don't have a steady job. Like how you disappear for weeks at a time without explanation. And when you come back, you look different. Tired in a way that's not just physical." She paused, watching my face for a reaction I was determined not to give. "And like how you never talk about what you actually do with your time. Everyone else overshares about their work, their relationships, their problems. You just deflect. You ask questions about other people's lives, and somehow never answer any about your own." The accuracy of her observations was unsettling, though not entirely surprising. Emma had always been perceptive, even as children. She was the one who noticed when I was upset about something at school before I said anything, the one who could tell when I was hiding an injury or covering up some minor disaster. But those were childhood concerns, scraped knees and failed tests and friendship drama. This was different. This was about life choices that could get people killed if the wrong information reached the wrong ears. "Maybe I'm just private," I said, though even as I spoke the words, I knew they sounded weak. Privacy was one thing. The level of compartmentalization I maintained was something else entirely. Emma laughed, but it wasn't cruel. "Rachel, you're not private. You're secretive. There's a difference. Private people don't answer personal questions because they value boundaries. Secretive people don't answer questions because they're hiding something significant." Before I could respond, she continued, "I'm not asking you to tell me what it is. I'm just saying that I know there's more to you than what Mom sees when she looks at you. And whatever it is, I hope you know that it doesn't change how I feel about you. You're my sister. That matters more than whatever career path you've chosen or haven't chosen." The genuine affection in her voice caught me off guard. I'd spent so many years feeling like an outsider in my own family that I'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone actually see me as a person, rather than as a problem to be solved, or a disappointment to be managed. Even if Emma couldn't see the whole truth, even if she didn't understand the specifics of my situation, she was offering something I hadn't realized I was hungry for: acceptance without conditions. My phone buzzed again, and I glanced at the screen to see another text from Martinez. "Urgent. 3 new victims recovered. Need debrief ASAP." The words sent a familiar jolt of adrenaline through my system, the automatic response that came from months of being on call for situations that couldn't wait for convenient timing. Emma noticed my change in expression. "Work?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "Something like that," I said, which was both true and completely inadequate. "I might have to leave early." She nodded like this was exactly what she'd expected. The mysterious job that pulls you away from family events strikes again. There was no accusation in her voice, just resignation mixed with what might have been understanding. It occurred to me that Emma had probably defended my absences more than I knew, had probably fielded questions from Mom and other family members about why I never seemed to prioritize family gatherings, why I was always the first to leave or the last to arrive or sometimes absent altogether. "Emma?" I started, then stopped, unsure how to navigate the space between what I wanted to say and what I could safely reveal. "Thank you for what you said. It means more than you know." She smiled, the same warm expression I remembered from childhood when she would defend me against neighborhood bullies or cover for me when I broke Mom's favorite vase playing ball in the house. That's what sisters are for, right? Seeing each other clearly, even when the rest of the world doesn't. We stood in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching the lights of Seattle flicker through the rain across the water. I thought about the victims Martinez had mentioned, about 3 more lives that had been changed forever by the network we'd been working to dismantle. I thought about the testimony I'd have to give, the evidence I'd need to review, the careful balance between justice and protection that defined every case like this. And I thought about the woman standing beside me, celebrating her engagement while her sister prepared to disappear again into work that couldn't be explained or understood by anyone outside the law enforcement community. The distance between our lives felt vast in that moment, not just because of the secrets I kept, but because of the fundamental difference in our daily realities. Emma lived in a world where problems had solutions, where hard work led to predictable outcomes, where success could be measured and celebrated openly. I lived in a world where success meant that terrible things stopped happening to innocent people, where victory looked like empty buildings and arrested criminals and survivors who might someday feel safe enough to trust again. "I should get back inside," Emma said eventually. "David's probably wondering where I disappeared to, and I still need to thank everyone for coming." I nodded, understanding that her absence from her own party would be noticed in ways that mine wouldn't be. "Go ahead. I'll be in shortly." She started toward the door, then turned back. "Rachel, whatever you're really doing with your life, I hope it's something that makes you happy. You deserve that, regardless of what anyone else thinks about your choices." After she left, I stood alone on the patio and called Martinez back. He answered on the first ring, his voice carrying the tension that always accompanied the recovery of trafficking victims. "Chen, where are you?" "Seattle. Family event. What's the situation?" 3 girls, aged 14 to 17, recovered from a location in Tacoma about 2 hours ago. They were moved from the Portland operation we dismantled last month. Local PD called us in when they realized the connection. The girls are asking for you specifically. My chest tightened. In undercover work, you build relationships with victims as part of establishing your credibility with the criminals you're targeting. But those relationships don't end when the case closes. The victims remember the person who helped them, even if they never knew your real name or your real job. They remember the face that represented safety in a world that had offered them nothing but danger. "I can be there in an hour," I said, already calculating the drive time from the resort to the field office. "Are you sure? I know tonight was supposed to be personal time." I looked back through the glass doors at the celebration continuing inside, at the tables full of people toasting my sister's happiness, while completely unaware that 3 teenage girls were sitting in a federal building an hour away, probably scared and confused and desperately needing to see a familiar face. The choice wasn't difficult. "I'm sure. Send me the address." I hung up and stood for another moment, preparing myself for the transition from Rachel, the disappointing daughter, to Agent Chen, the federal investigator. It was a shift I'd made hundreds of times, but it never got easier. If anything, the contrast became more jarring each time, the distance between my public identity and my professional reality stretching wider with each case. Inside, I found my way back to Table 8, where Lisa and Mr. Peterson were engaged in what appeared to be a spirited discussion about the merits of different types of garden mulch. I gathered my purse and coat quietly, not wanting to draw attention to my departure. "Leaving early?" Lisa asked, and I could hear the understanding in her voice. She'd probably attended enough family events where she'd wanted to make a strategic exit. "Work emergency," I said, which was true enough. Mr. Peterson looked up from his gardening stories. "Must be important to pull you away from a celebration like this." If only he knew, I thought. "Yes, it is." I made my way toward the front of the room, intending to find Emma and offer a quick goodbye, but I was intercepted by Mom before I could reach my sister. She appeared at my elbow with that particular smile she used when she was about to say something unpleasant while maintaining plausible deniability about her intentions. "Leaving so soon, Rachel? The evening is just getting started. I have a work situation that needs my attention." Her expression sharpened slightly. "Work situation? I thought you were between positions right now." This was the trap I'd walked into countless times before. Any mention of work commitments would lead to questions about what kind of work required immediate attention on a Saturday night, which would lead to more questions about why I was so vague about my employment, which would eventually circle back to her favorite theme about my inability to maintain stable employment. "It's complicated," I said, hoping to end the conversation before it gained momentum. But Mom was already warming to her subject. "You know, Rachel, I was talking to Janet Morrison earlier, and her daughter just got promoted to senior associate at her law firm. Janet was saying how nice it must be to have a child whose career trajectory you can actually explain to people." The comment landed exactly as intended. We were surrounded by people celebrating Emma's engagement, Emma's success, Emma's bright future with a man who represented everything Mom valued in terms of stability and social status. And here I was, the other daughter, the one whose life choices were apparently so inexplicable that they couldn't be discussed in polite company. "I'm sure Janet's daughter is very accomplished," I said evenly, refusing to take the bait. "Oh, she is. And so is Emma, of course. It's wonderful to have daughters you can be proud of, daughters who make choices that reflect well on the family." Mom's smile never wavered, but her meaning was crystal clear. Standing there in my 4-year-old dress, preparing to leave my sister's engagement party to help teenage trafficking victims, I felt the familiar surge of frustration that came from being so thoroughly misunderstood by someone who was supposed to know me better than anyone. But beneath the frustration was something else, something that had been building for months as I watched Mom diminish my value at every family gathering while remaining completely oblivious to the actual impact of my work. "I need to go," I said, simply, not trusting myself to say anything else without revealing more than I should. "Of course you do," Mom replied, and there was just enough resignation in her voice to suggest that my early departure was exactly what she'd expected. "Give Emma my love, won't you? And try to think about what we discussed at Christmas about finding something more substantial." I found Emma near the head table, laughing at something David was saying while she arranged the engagement gifts that had been displayed for everyone to admire. When she saw me approaching, her expression shifted to concern. "Everything okay?" "I have to leave. Work emergency." She nodded, unsurprised. The mysterious job strikes again. "Be careful, okay? Whatever it is you really do, just be careful." I hugged her goodbye, holding on perhaps a moment longer than usual, struck by the realization that she was the only person in the room who seemed to genuinely care about my well-being rather than my ability to meet their expectations. The drive from the resort to the Federal Building took me through the heart of Seattle, past neighborhoods where normal people were settling in for Saturday evening routines that probably involved television and takeout food, and the comfortable predictability of lives that didn't involve emergency phone calls about recovered trafficking victims. The rain had intensified again, and I had to concentrate on the road while my mind shifted gears from family dynamics to case management. By the time I reached the field office, I had successfully compartmentalized the evening's family drama and focused entirely on the 3 girls who were waiting for me. Martinez met me in the lobby, his expression grim in the way that always accompanied cases involving juvenile victims. "How bad?" I asked as we walked toward the interview rooms. "Bad enough. They're scared, traumatized, asking for the woman who helped them in Portland. They remember you as Sarah, the older sister who worked for the cleaning company." Sarah. Collins had been my cover identity for 18 months, a young woman from a troubled background who took cash jobs cleaning offices and houses for the network that used legitimate businesses as fronts for their trafficking operations. Sarah was quiet, reliable, and most importantly, invisible to the men who ran the organization. She was also the person who had slowly, carefully built trust with victims while gathering the evidence that would eventually bring down their captors. Do they know Sarah wasn't real? We haven't explained the undercover aspect yet. We wanted you to handle that conversation. They've been through enough without having their sense of reality completely upended by strangers. As we approached the interview rooms, I felt the familiar weight of responsibility that came with being the bridge between 2 worlds. These girls had survived something unimaginable, and now they needed to trust a system that probably felt as foreign and potentially dangerous as the situation they'd been rescued from. My job was to help them understand that safety was possible, that justice was achievable, and that their lives could eventually belong to them again. But first, I had to explain why the person they remembered as their protector had a different name and a different job than they'd believed. I had to help them understand that while Sarah Collins had been a fiction, the care and concern she'd shown them had been completely real. Part 3. The first girl was barely 15, with dark hair that needed washing and eyes that held too much knowledge for someone her age. She sat in the interview room with a victim advocate, wrapped in an oversized FBI sweatshirt, clutching a cup of hot chocolate like it was the only solid thing in her world. When I walked through the door, her entire posture changed. "Sarah," she said, and the relief in her voice nearly broke my heart. "I told them you would come. I told them you promised you would help us if we ever needed it." I sat down across from her, maintaining the careful balance between professional distance and genuine care that defined this kind of work. "Hi, Maria. I'm glad you're safe now. I'm glad you remembered what I told you about asking for help." Maria had been one of the older girls in the Portland operation, forced to supervise the younger victims while the men who controlled them conducted their business. She'd been suspicious of me at first, probably sensing that I didn't quite fit the profile of the other women who worked for the organization. But over months of careful interaction, she'd begun to trust me enough to share small pieces of information that had helped build our case. "They're asking me questions about what happened," she said, glancing nervously at the victim advocate. "But I want to tell you. I want to tell you everything because you were there. You saw what they did." This was the moment I'd been dreading. The moment when I had to explain that Sarah Collins, the cleaning lady who had shown kindness to trafficked children, was actually Special Agent Rachel Chen, a federal investigator who had been gathering evidence for a prosecution that would put their captors away for life. "Maria, I need to tell you something important about who I really am. My name isn't Sarah Collins. My real name is Rachel Chen, and I'm an FBI agent. I was working undercover when we met, which means I was pretending to be someone else in order to help catch the people who hurt you." I watched her process this information, saw the confusion and hurt flicker across her face before being replaced by something that might have been understanding. These kids had survived by learning to read people quickly, by identifying threats, and allies in situations where the difference could mean life or death. Maria was smart enough to understand that the woman who had slipped her extra food and promised that someone would come for her eventually had been telling the truth about the important things, even if she'd lied about her name and her job. "Are you still going to help us?" she asked finally. "Yes, that was never a lie. I'm going to help you testify against the people who hurt you, if you're willing to do that. And I'm going to make sure you have everything you need to build a new life, a safe life." We talked for 2 hours. Maria told me about the month since, the Portland raid, about being moved from location to location as the organization tried to maintain their operations while avoiding law enforcement attention. She told me about the new girls who had been brought in, some as young as 12, and about the men who had made it clear that anyone who tried to escape or ask for help would face consequences that extended to their families back home. But she also told me about the moments when she'd remembered our conversations, when she'd held on to the hope that someone was looking for her, that the promise of rescue hadn't been empty. She told me about helping the younger girls stay strong, about sharing the techniques I'd taught her for staying mentally present during the worst moments, about keeping alive the belief that their lives could be different. When we finished, I walked her back to the residential facility where she would stay while the legal process played out. It was a good place, run by people who understood trauma and recovery, but it was still an institution. Still a place where she would have to follow rules and schedules and live with strangers while slowly learning to trust that she was truly free. The second girl, Anna, was 16 and had been with the organization for less than 3 months. She was newer to the life, less hardened by the experience, but also more fragile in some ways. She cried when she saw me, relief and terror mixing in a way that reminded me why this work mattered, even when it meant missing family celebrations and maintaining cover stories that alienated the people I loved. Anna's interview was shorter, but more intense. She'd been moved to Tacoma just days before the raid, and she had information about locations and procedures that would be crucial for preventing other operations from filling the gap left by the arrests. But she was also struggling with guilt about surviving when other girls hadn't, about the choices she'd been forced to make, about the family members back in El Salvador who had been threatened if she didn't cooperate. "I want to go home," she told me through tears, "but they said if I go home, if I ever go home, something will happen to my little sister. They know where she goes to school. They know her name." This was the part of trafficking cases that kept me awake at night. The victims were often trapped not just by physical restraints, but by threats against family members who lived thousands of miles away and had no idea their loved one was being used as leverage to ensure compliance. Rescue was only the first step in a process that could take years to complete. "We're going to work with law enforcement in El Salvador," I told her. "We're going to make sure your sister is safe, and we're going to make sure the people who threatened her can't hurt anyone in your family. But that's going to take time, and I need you to be patient while we handle the legal aspects." The third girl was the youngest, barely 14, and she'd been with the organization for over a year. She was quiet, withdrawn, and seemed to expect punishment for every question she answered or favor she accepted. Her name was Sophia, and she'd been recruited in Guatemala with promises of legitimate work in the United States that would allow her to send money back to her family. Sophia's interview was the most difficult because she'd been so thoroughly conditioned to distrust authority figures that she couldn't quite believe that the law enforcement officers surrounding her were actually there to help rather than to prosecute her for immigration violations or prostitution charges. She'd been told repeatedly that police were not her friends, that government agents would deport her immediately if they discovered her presence in the country, that her only protection came from cooperation with the organization that controlled her. "Sarah told me that someone would come," she said quietly, speaking more to her hands than to me. "But I thought that was just something people say to make you feel better." "It wasn't something I said to make you feel better," I replied. "It was a promise." And keeping promises to people who have been hurt is one of the most important parts of my job. By the time I finished the interviews, it was almost midnight. Martinez walked me to my car, both of us exhausted by the emotional weight of the evening and the legal complexities that lay ahead. "Good work tonight," he said. "Those girls trust you. That's going to make a huge difference in their recovery and in the prosecution." I thought about Emma's party, about the celebration that had continued without me while I sat in interview rooms with teenage survivors of trafficking. I thought about Mom's comments about career choices that could be explained in polite company, about daughters who made choices that reflected well on the family. "Martinez, do you ever wish you could tell people what we actually do? Not the details, obviously, but just the reality of it?" He leaned against my car, considering the question. "You mean, do I wish my family understood why I miss dinners and cancel vacations and sometimes disappear for weeks at a time?" "Something like that. Every day," he said. "But then I think about nights like tonight, about kids like Maria and Anna and Sophia who are alive and safe because we did our jobs well. And I think about all the other kids who won't be trafficked because we dismantled this network. And it seems like a fair trade, even when it's lonely." Part 4. The following Monday morning, I sat in the federal courthouse preparing to testify in a related case, reviewing my notes while prosecutors finalized their strategy for questioning. The courtroom was nearly empty except for law enforcement personnel and legal staff, but the weight of the testimony felt enormous. Everything we'd worked for over the past 18 months would be validated or undermined based on how well we could present our evidence while protecting the identities and safety of the victims. My phone buzzed with a text from Emma. "Hope your work emergency ended well. Mom asked me to invite you to dinner next Sunday. David's parents want to meet the whole family." I stared at the message, imagining myself sitting around Emma's dining room table trying to make small talk about my career, while David's parents evaluated whether my family was suitable for their son. The irony was staggering. While they worried about social compatibility, I would be spending the week reviewing evidence that would put human traffickers behind bars for decades. But Emma's invitation represented something important. Despite Mom's public comments at the engagement party, despite the ongoing family narrative about my failure to launch, Emma was still including me. Still insisting that I belonged at family gatherings, still treating me like someone whose presence mattered. I texted back that I'd try to make it, knowing that I probably wouldn't be able to commit until I saw how the legal proceedings developed over the week. The prosecutor called my name, and I walked to the witness stand with the same measured confidence I'd cultivated for every professional situation that required me to be taken seriously by people who might be inclined to underestimate me. Federal. Court was formal, intimidating by design, but it was also a place where evidence mattered more than assumptions, where the truth carried more weight than social expectations. For 3 hours, I testified about the investigation that had led us to the defendants. I explained how undercover operations work, how agents build credibility within criminal organizations, how evidence is gathered and verified while maintaining cover identities. I described the process of identifying victims, establishing trust, and coordinating rescues that prioritize safety over speed. The defense attorney was skilled, aggressive in the way that expensive lawyers are when they're trying to create reasonable doubt about law enforcement procedures. He questioned my methods, my motivations, my ability to distinguish between friendship and manipulation when building relationships with victims. He suggested that my testimony might be colored by personal investment in the outcome, that my emotional connection to the victims might compromise my objectivity about the evidence. But I'd been preparing for these questions for years. Every undercover agent learns to defend their methods under hostile questioning, to explain the ethical framework that governs infiltration operations, to justify the deception that makes their work possible. I answered each question directly, thoroughly, without defensiveness or apology. "Agent Chen," the defense attorney said during cross-examination, "isn't it true that you formed personal relationships with alleged victims that exceeded the boundaries of professional law enforcement?" "Work? No," I replied. "I formed relationships that were necessary to establish trust and gather evidence. Those relationships were carefully managed within the guidelines established for undercover operations. But you testified that you promised these alleged victims that help would come. You offered reassurance about their futures. Isn't that going beyond evidence gathering into personal involvement? Offering hope to trafficking victims is part of building the trust necessary to gather evidence that protects other potential victims. It's also basic human decency when you're interacting with children who are being exploited." The prosecutor smiled slightly at my response. We'd practiced this line of questioning, anticipated the defense strategy of portraying agents as either heartless manipulators or emotionally compromised advocates. The key was demonstrating that professional law enforcement work could include genuine care for victims without compromising investigative integrity. After 4 hours of testimony, I was dismissed with the thanks of the court and the knowledge that my part in this particular legal proceeding was complete. The defendants would likely be convicted based on the evidence we'd gathered. The victims would have their day in court, and another network of traffickers would be dismantled. But walking out of the courthouse, I felt the familiar emptiness that followed the completion of major cases. The work was done, justice would be served, and I would return to my regular life while the survivors began the long process of rebuilding theirs. The transition from Agent Chen, federal investigator, back to Rachel, disappointing daughter, felt jarring after the intensity of the morning. I drove home to my small apartment in Capitol Hill, a modest space that reflected my cover story more than my actual financial situation. Federal agents earn decent salaries, but maintaining an undercover identity often requires living below your means to avoid questions about income sources that don't match your supposed employment status. The apartment was quiet, sparse, decorated, with the kind of generic furniture that suggested someone who hadn't quite settled into their life yet, which wasn't entirely inaccurate. I'd been living temporarily for so long that I'd forgotten how to create spaces that felt permanent, how to surround myself with things that reflected who I actually was, rather than who I needed to appear to be. I made coffee and sat at my small kitchen table, reviewing the week ahead. More testimony in related cases, meetings with prosecutors about additional charges, debriefings with other agents who had worked peripheral aspects of the investigation. The administrative side of justice was less dramatic than the undercover work, but equally important for ensuring that prosecutions were successful and that survivors received the support they needed. My personal phone rang, and I was surprised to see Mom's name on the caller ID. We didn't talk often outside of family gatherings, and when we did, it was usually because she had criticism to deliver or advice to offer about my life choices. "Rachel, I wanted to talk to you about Sunday dinner at Emma's. I know you said you'd try to make it, but I think it would be better if you had a concrete commitment." "I'm not sure I can commit to anything concrete right now. My work schedule is unpredictable." There was a pause, and I could practically hear her marshaling her patience for another conversation about my employment situation. Rachel, this is exactly what I mean when I say you need to think about your priorities. Emma is introducing David's parents to the family. This is important. This is the kind of event that requires you to make adjustments to accommodate family obligations. I understand that it's important to Emma. It's important to all of us. We're trying to make a good impression on people who could become part of our family. We need to present ourselves as the kind of people who value commitment and stability. The implication was clear. My presence was desired not because my family wanted me there, but because my absence would be noticed and potentially commented upon by David's parents. I was being asked to attend as a prop in the performance of Family Unity, to play the role of successful second daughter so that Emma's future in-laws wouldn't question whether she came from the right kind of family. What if I told you that my work this week involves helping teenage trafficking victims prepare for trial testimony that could put their captors away for life? I said, the words coming out before I could stop them. Would that change your perspective on which obligations should take priority? The silence stretched so long that I wondered if the call had dropped. When Mom finally spoke, her voice carried the particular tone she used when she thought I was being deliberately difficult. Rachel, I don't know what kind of volunteer work you're doing, but comparing it to family obligations is inappropriate. Emma needs you there on Sunday. That's more important than whatever causes you've been getting involved with. Volunteer work. She'd heard trafficking victims and trial testimony and interpreted it as volunteer work. The idea that I might be professionally involved in federal prosecutions, that I might have responsibilities that couldn't be postponed for family dinners, didn't even register as a possibility. It's not volunteer work, Mom. Well, whatever. It is. I'm sure it's very meaningful to you. But sometimes we have to make choices about what really matters. Family should come first, especially when it comes to supporting Emma during this important time in her life. After we hung up, I sat in my quiet apartment and wondered what would happen if I simply showed up to Sunday dinner and introduced myself, honestly. Hi, I'm Rachel, Emma's sister. I'm a federal agent specializing in human trafficking cases. I've been working undercover for the past 3 years, which is why I've been vague about my employment. Last week, I helped rescue 3 teenage girls from a trafficking operation, and this week I'm testifying to help put their captors in prison. The fantasy was appealing for about 30 seconds, until I remembered the security implications of revealing my identity to people outside law enforcement, the ongoing cases that could be compromised if my cover were blown, and the victims whose safety depended on my ability to maintain operational security. But beyond the professional constraints, there was something else that stopped me from imagining that conversation. The fear that even if I could tell them the truth, even if security weren't an issue, they still wouldn't see my work as valuable. They'd find ways to diminish it, to suggest that it wasn't really a career so much as an extended phase, to question why I'd chosen such a difficult and dangerous path when I could have pursued something more conventional. Part 5. Thursday. Afternoon, I received a call that changed everything. Martinez's voice was tense when I answered, carrying the kind of urgency that usually meant either a major breakthrough or a significant problem. Chen, we've got a situation. One of the victims from the Tacoma raid, Sophia. She's asking to speak with you specifically. But it's not about testimony. She says she has information about her family that she didn't feel comfortable sharing during the initial interviews. What kind of information? She won't say. She just keeps asking for Sarah. Asking when Sarah is coming back. The victim advocates think she's been holding back something significant, but she'll only talk to you. I was already reaching for my car keys. I can be there in 40 minutes. There's something else. She mentioned a name we haven't heard before. Someone called El Doctor. The way she said it, it sounds like this person might be connected to the organization at a higher level than anyone we've identified so far. El Doctor. The title sent a chill through me, partly because it suggested a level of organization and sophistication that we hadn't yet uncovered, and partly because Sophia had trusted me enough to share information she'd been too frightened to reveal to anyone else. If she was ready to talk about someone significant enough to warrant that kind of respectful fear, it meant she'd decided to trust the system completely, despite everything she'd experienced. The residential facility where Sophia was staying was a converted house in a quiet neighborhood, designed to feel more like a home than an institution. But it was still surrounded by security measures, still staffed by people trained to work with severely traumatized children, still a place where teenage survivors of trafficking learned to navigate freedom after months or years of captivity. Sophia was waiting in one of the common rooms, wearing jeans and a sweater that probably represented the first clothing she'd been allowed to choose for herself in over a year. She looked healthier than she had during our first interview. Less fragile, but there was still something guarded in her expression that suggested she was carefully evaluating every interaction for signs of danger. "Hi, Sophia. I heard you wanted to talk to me." She nodded but didn't speak immediately. The victim advocate who had been staying with her gave us privacy while remaining close enough to intervene if Sophia became overwhelmed by the conversation. "I didn't tell you everything before," Sophia said finally. "There were things I was too scared to say, even after you said we were safe. That's okay. You've been through something terrible, and it takes time to feel safe enough to share everything. What did you want to tell me now?" "There's a man. They called him El Doctor, but he's not a doctor for sick people. He's the one who decides what happens to girls like us. He's the one who says where we go, who we work for, what happens if we try to leave." I kept my expression neutral, but internally, I was processing the implications of what she was telling me. If there was someone at the organizational level we hadn't identified, someone making strategic decisions about victim placement and movement, it meant our investigation had only scratched the surface of the network. "Can you tell me more about El Doctor? What he looks like, how often you saw him, what he said when you were around." "I only saw him twice, but the other girls talked about him. They said he was the one who decided everything. He came to check on us in Portland, and then again after they moved us to Tacoma. He looked at us like we were things he owned, not people." Sophia described a man in his 50s, well-dressed, who spoke to the trafficking victims in Spanish but conducted business conversations in English. He carried himself with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question, and the other criminals in the organization treated him with deference that suggested he held significant power within the hierarchy. But more importantly, Sophia had overheard conversations between El Doctor and the men who had directly controlled the day-to-day operations. Conversations about expanding into new territories, about establishing operations in cities where law enforcement attention was less intense, about importing victims from different countries to diversify their supply chain. He talked about Seattle, Sophia said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. He said Seattle was too hot now, that they needed to move south. But he also said they had people in Seattle who could help if the police got too close. This was the information that would break the case wide open. If El Doctor had law enforcement contacts, if there were corrupt officials providing protection for trafficking operations, it meant the network was more sophisticated and more dangerous than we'd realized. It also meant that Sophia had just provided information that could expose corruption at levels that would send shockwaves through multiple agencies. "Sophia, this information is very important. It's going to help us stop El Doctor from hurting other girls like you." The information Sophia shared about El Doctor and his potential law enforcement connections meant that our investigation had suddenly become exponentially more complex and dangerous. I spent the rest of the afternoon in emergency meetings with Martinez and the federal prosecutors, trying to determine how to proceed without alerting anyone who might be feeding information to the trafficking network. By Friday evening, I was mentally and emotionally exhausted from the week's revelations, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was building toward a confrontation I wasn't prepared for. The corruption angle meant that standard investigative procedures might be compromised, that people we normally trusted might be working against us, that the cases we'd built so carefully could be undermined by someone with access to our evidence. I was reviewing case files in my apartment when my phone rang. Emma's name appeared on the screen, and I answered expecting another reminder about Sunday dinner. Instead, her voice was tight with concern. "Rachel, something weird happened today. A man came to my office asking questions about you. He said he was from some kind of federal agency, but something felt off about the whole interaction. Every instinct I'd developed over 3 years of undercover work went on high alert." "What kind of questions?" "He wanted to know about your employment history, your financial situation, whether you'd ever mentioned being involved in any kind of legal proceedings. He also asked about your travel patterns, whether you disappear for long periods, whether you've ever mentioned having enemies or being afraid of anyone." This was wrong on multiple levels. Federal agents don't conduct family interviews without authorization, and they certainly don't approach family members of undercover agents without going through proper channels. Someone was fishing for information about my identity and my work, and they were using Emma to do it. "Did he show you identification?" "He did, but I didn't look at it closely. He seemed legitimate, official. But afterward, I started thinking about how he knew where I worked, how he knew enough about our family to ask specific questions. And I remembered what you said about your work being complicated. I was already moving around my apartment, gathering the emergency kit I kept prepared for situations that required immediate relocation, phone chargers, cash, a change of clothes, backup identification, emergency contact numbers for Martinez and other agents who could be trusted absolutely. Emma, I need you to listen to me very carefully. The man who came to your office was not a legitimate federal agent. Someone is trying to gather information about me, and they're using you to do it. I need you to call David and tell him to pick you up from work immediately. Don't go home alone tonight." "Rachel, you're scaring me. What kind of trouble are you in?" There wasn't time to explain the security implications of what I did for a living, the ways that undercover work could create enemies who would use family members as leverage. There wasn't time to help her understand that the vague job description I'd been maintaining for years wasn't just privacy. It was protection. "I'm not in trouble, but someone dangerous is trying to find me, and they think you might have information that could help them. Just trust me and do what I'm asking. Stay with David tonight. Don't go to your apartment alone, and don't talk to anyone else who claims to be from federal agencies unless they can verify their identity through official channels." After we hung up, I called Martinez and explained the situation. His reaction confirmed my worst fears about the implications of Sophia's information about L Doctor's law enforcement connections. "We need to assume your cover has been compromised," he said without preamble. "If someone is approaching your family members with fake credentials, it means they know enough about your real identity to target people close to you." "What's the protocol for family protection in undercover compromise situations?" "Normally, we'd move you to a safe house and provide security for immediate family members until we could assess the threat level. But if there's corruption in the pipeline, we can't use standard protocols. We need to assume that normal channels have been compromised." This was the nightmare scenario that every undercover agent fears. The moment when your professional life and your personal life collide in ways that put innocent people in danger. Emma had no idea that her decision to become engaged to David had made her a target for people who traffic human beings. No idea that her sister's work had created risks that extended far beyond the original investigation. Martinez and I agreed that I would relocate immediately to a secure facility while they worked to identify the source of the security breach. Emma and David would be provided with protection, though they would likely never know the full extent of the danger they were in or the reasons behind the security measures. But first, I had to make a choice that would fundamentally change my relationship with my family. I had to decide whether to maintain my cover story and leave them confused and frightened by the sudden security measures, or whether to break protocol and tell them enough of the truth to help them understand why their lives were being disrupted. I thought about Mom's comments at the engagement party, about her inability to see value in work that couldn't be easily explained or celebrated. I thought about the years of family gatherings where I'd been positioned as the disappointing daughter, the one who couldn't get her life together, the one whose choices reflected poorly on the family. And I thought about Emma, who had stood on the patio at her engagement party and told me she knew there was more to my story than what people could see. Emma, who had defended me in ways I probably didn't even know about, who had continued to include me in family events despite Mom's obvious disapproval of my lifestyle choices. If I was going to put my sister in danger because of my work, the least I could do was help her understand why. I called Emma back, and this time I didn't hedge or deflect when she asked questions about my work. Emma, I need to tell you something. About my job. About why someone might be trying to gather information about me through you. But I need you to promise that you won't share this information with anyone, including Mom, until I tell you it's safe to do so. Rachel, what is going on? I'm a federal agent. I work for the FBI, specializing in human trafficking investigations. For the past 3 years, I've been working undercover operations that have resulted in the arrests of dozens of people involved in trafficking networks. The man who approached you today was probably connected to one of those networks, trying to identify me so that they can eliminate the threat I represent to their operations. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. When Emma finally spoke, her voice carried a mixture of shock, understanding, and something that might have been relief. That's why you're always vague about work. That's why you disappear for weeks at a time. That's why you never talk about your colleagues or your office or any of the normal things people share about their jobs. Yes, and that's why someone approaching you with questions about my life is so dangerous. They're not trying to conduct a routine background check. They're trying to find ways to hurt me, and they think you might be a useful tool for doing that. Are you safe? It was such a simple question, but it carried so much weight. Was I safe? Was anyone safe when they chose to dedicate their lives to fighting organizations that trafficked human beings for profit? Was safety even the right metric for evaluating whether the work was worth doing? I'm trained for this kind of situation, I said, which wasn't exactly an answer, but was the most reassurance I could offer. And there are protocols in place to protect agents and their families when operations become compromised. What do you need me to do? That was Emma. No recriminations about the years of deception, no demands for detailed explanations about why I'd never trusted her with the truth. Just a simple question about how she could help protect both of us from people who meant us harm. I need you to follow the security protocols that federal agents will explain to you over the next few days. I need you to trust that the people providing protection know what they're doing. And I need you to help me decide how much of this to tell Mom and the rest of the family. We talked for another hour, with me explaining the basic framework of undercover operations while carefully avoiding details that could compromise ongoing investigations or put her at additional risk. Emma asked intelligent questions about the work itself, about the victims I'd helped, about the networks we'd dismantled, about the legal processes that followed successful operations. But she also asked personal questions that were harder to answer. Questions about what it felt like to live with such an elaborate deception, about whether I'd ever wanted to tell the family the truth, about how it felt to be dismissed and underestimated when I was actually doing work that most people would consider heroic. I think about Mom's speech at my engagement party, Emma said near the end of our conversation. I think about how she talked about you like you were a failure, like you were someone to be pitied or managed. And now I find out that while she was saying those things, you were literally risking your life to save people from slavery. The work is important, I said. It's worth the personal cost, including the cost of being misunderstood by people I love. But it shouldn't have to cost that. You shouldn't have to choose between doing work that matters and having a family that supports you. After we hung up, I finished packing my emergency kit and prepared to leave the apartment that had been my home for 2 years. The place had never felt permanent, but it had been safe. And safety was about to become a much more complicated concept in my life. Martinez called with instructions for the secure facility where I would be staying while the investigation team worked to identify the source of the security breach. It was a safe house in a residential neighborhood, designed to look like an ordinary rental property while actually being equipped with security systems and communication equipment that would allow me to continue working on the case from a protected location. But before I left, I made one more call to Mom. "Rachel, I was just thinking about you. Emma mentioned that you might not be able to make it to Sunday dinner after all. I hope this doesn't mean you're having another one of your employment situations." There it was, the automatic assumption that any disruption in my schedule must be related to my inability to maintain stable employment. The casual dismissal of my time as less valuable than other people's commitments. The suggestion that my work, whatever it was, couldn't possibly be important enough to justify missing family obligations. "Mom, I need to tell you something about my work. Something I should have told you years ago, but couldn't because of security restrictions." "Oh, Rachel, please don't tell me you've gotten involved in something questionable. I've been hoping you would find something legitimate, something stable. I work for the FBI. I'm a federal agent specializing in human trafficking investigations. The reason I've been vague about my employment is that I work undercover operations that require maintaining false identities for months or years at a time. The reason I sometimes disappear or miss family events is that I'm working cases that involve rescuing people from slavery and putting the criminals who enslave them in prison." The silence that followed was different from Emma's silence, where Emma had been processing information that explained years of questions. Mom seemed to be struggling with information that contradicted years of assumptions about who I was and what my life represented. "Rachel, this sounds like something from a television show. Are you sure you're not exaggerating your role in whatever organization you work for?" Even confronted with the truth about my career, her first instinct was to suggest that I was inflating my importance, that I was trying to make myself sound more significant than I actually was. The woman who had called me worthless at my sister's engagement party couldn't quite accept that I might actually be doing work that mattered. "Mom, I'm not exaggerating anything. I'm a special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I've been working trafficking cases for 3 years. I've helped rescue dozens of victims, and I've helped prosecute the people who hurt them. It's dangerous work, which is why I haven't been able to talk about it, and why I sometimes have to prioritize case obligations over family events. If this is true, why didn't you tell us? Why did you let us think you were struggling?" There it was, the question that cut to the heart of our relationship. Why had I allowed my family to believe that I was failing when I was actually succeeding in work that most people would consider important and heroic? Because the work requires secrecy. Because telling people about undercover operations can compromise investigations and put victims at risk. And because I wasn't sure you would understand the value of work that doesn't come with the kind of social status that you and Emma have built your careers around. Part 7. The safe house was located in a quiet suburb about 30 minutes outside Seattle, designed to blend seamlessly into a neighborhood of modest family homes and well-maintained gardens. From the outside, it looked like the kind of place where a young professional might live while saving money for something better. Inside, it was equipped with secure communication systems, reinforced windows, and discreet security cameras that monitored every approach to the property. I spent the first few hours getting oriented to the security protocols and communication systems, then settled into what would become my temporary office in the converted second bedroom. Martinez had arranged for case files to be delivered securely, along with a laptop that was isolated from regular internet access, but connected to FBI databases through encrypted channels. The isolation was both necessary and difficult. For 3 years, I'd lived with the controlled deception of undercover work, maintaining relationships and identities that were carefully constructed to serve investigative purposes. But I'd also maintained my real identity in my personal life, even if I couldn't share the details of my professional life with family members. Now, both identities were compromised. Sarah Collins, the cleaning woman who had infiltrated trafficking networks, was blown. And Rachel Chen, the sister and daughter who attended family gatherings while keeping professional secrets, was also burned. Someone had connected the two identities and was using that information to target both my work and my family. The first few days passed in a blur of secure phone calls and encrypted video conferences with investigative teams who were working to identify the source of the security breach. The corruption angle that Sophia had revealed was complicating every aspect of the investigation because we couldn't be sure which law enforcement officials could be trusted with sensitive information. Meanwhile, Emma was learning to live with the security protocols that had been put in place to protect her and David. Federal agents were monitoring their movements, sweeping their apartments for surveillance devices, and screening their communications for signs that they were being watched or followed. She called me twice a day, partly for updates on the investigation, and partly because she was struggling to process the reality of my actual career. Our conversations were necessarily brief and carefully monitored, but they gave me a connection to normalcy that helped balance the stress of the security situation. "How long have you been doing this kind of work?" she asked during one of our evening calls. 3 years in trafficking specifically, but I've been with the Bureau for 5 years total. I started in financial crimes, then moved to undercover operations when I showed aptitude for deep cover work. Deep cover means what, exactly? It means becoming someone else completely for months or years at a time, creating an entire identity with background, employment history, social connections, everything needed to convince criminals that you're not law enforcement. That sounds incredibly lonely. She wasn't wrong. The isolation of undercover work went beyond the obvious challenges of maintaining false identities and avoiding detection. It also meant living with the knowledge that your real relationships were necessarily superficial, that the people who thought they knew you actually knew, carefully constructed personas designed to serve investigative purposes. But there was also something powerful about the work, something that made the loneliness feel like a worthwhile sacrifice. When operations succeeded, when traffickers were arrested and victims were rescued, when legal processes resulted in convictions, that would prevent future crimes. The impact felt direct and measurable in ways that other kinds of work didn't. It is lonely sometimes, I admitted, but it's also important work. The victims we rescue, the networks we dismantle, the future crimes we prevent, it feels like the kind of work that justifies the personal cost. Have you ever thought about doing something else? Something that would let you have a more normal relationship with family? It was a fair question, one I'd considered during the more difficult periods of maintaining my cover. There were other specialties within federal law enforcement that didn't require the same level of deception, other ways to contribute to justice, that wouldn't necessitate keeping secrets from the people I loved. I've thought about it, but trafficking cases are different from other crimes. The victims are often children, often people who have been completely cut off from any support systems that might help them escape. They need someone who can get close enough to the criminals to gather evidence, someone who can build trust with victims who have been conditioned to distrust anyone in authority. Someone like you. Someone willing to disappear into a false identity for whatever time it takes to build cases that will hold up in court and result in convictions that protect other potential victims. On Thursday of my second week in the safe house, Martinez called with news that changed everything about our investigation. The corruption probe had identified the source of the security breach, and it was worse than anyone had anticipated. "We found him," Martinez said without preamble. "Detective Richard Morrison, Seattle PD. He's been feeding information to trafficking networks for at least 2 years, possibly longer. Phone records show communication with numbers associated with L Doctors Organization and financial records. show deposits that don't match his legitimate income. Detective Morrison was someone we'd worked with on multiple cases, someone who had access to investigative files and victim information, someone who could have warned trafficking networks about impending raids and provided intelligence about law enforcement operations. He was also someone who had been present during strategy meetings where my undercover identity had been discussed. How much does he know about my work? Potentially everything. He was briefed on the Portland operation, he had access to victim interview summaries, and he was present during at least 3 meetings where your cover identity was discussed in detail. This meant that Morrison had been in a position to provide trafficking networks with comprehensive information about my undercover work, my real identity, and my family connections. He could have told them about Emma's engagement, about Mom's social circle, about any family member who might be useful for gathering intelligence or applying pressure. But it also meant that we now had an opportunity to turn the situation to our advantage. If Morrison was the source of the intelligence that had compromised my safety, he was also someone who could provide information about Doctor's organization and the scope of law enforcement corruption within the trafficking network. What's the plan for approaching Morrison? We're going to offer him a choice: cooperation with a corruption investigation in exchange for reduced charges, or prosecution for conspiracy to facilitate human trafficking, along with whatever other charges we can build based on his financial records and communication history. The next few days were spent preparing for Morrison's arrest and the subsequent interrogation that would determine how much additional information we could gather about the trafficking network's law enforcement connections. I reviewed files related to every case where Morrison had been involved, looking for patterns that might indicate which operations had been compromised and which victims might have been put at additional risk because of his betrayal. But I also spent time thinking about what Morrison's arrest would mean for my own situation. If he was the primary source of the security breach, his removal might reduce the immediate danger to my family. But it wouldn't undo the fact that my undercover identity had been blown, and it wouldn't address the longer-term implications of having criminals who knew my real name and my family connections. On Friday morning, Martinez called to tell me that Morrison had been arrested at his home and was currently being interrogated by internal affairs investigators and federal agents. Initial reports suggested that he was prepared to cooperate in exchange for a plea agreement, which meant we might finally get comprehensive information about the scope of corruption within the trafficking network. He's asking for immunity in exchange for information about Doctor, Martinez said. Claims he can provide details about law enforcement corruption in 3 different cities, including the names of other officers who have been compromised. What's his story about how he got involved? Says it started with gambling debts, about 3 years ago. Doctor's organization approached him with offers to pay off his debts in exchange for occasional information about law enforcement activities. Claims it escalated gradually, that he never intended to become a full-time intelligence source for traffickers. It was a familiar story in corruption cases. Financial pressure leading to small compromises, which led to larger compromises, which eventually led to complete cooperation with criminal organizations. Morrison probably told himself that he was just providing harmless information, that he wasn't really facilitating crimes against vulnerable people, that he could stop anytime he wanted. But the reality was that his information had probably resulted in victims being moved before they could be rescued, evidence being destroyed before it could be collected, and criminals escaping prosecution because they knew about law enforcement operations in advance. Saturday afternoon, Emma called with news that the security protocols around her and David were being relaxed. The immediate threat seemed to have diminished with Morrison's arrest, though federal agents would continue monitoring the situation until they were confident that no other law enforcement personnel were involved in providing intelligence to trafficking networks. "Does this mean you can come home soon?" she asked. "It means the immediate crisis has passed, but I'm still waiting to hear about the longer-term implications for my career. My undercover identity is blown, which means I can't work trafficking cases the same way I have been. What will you do instead?" It was a question I'd been avoiding thinking about directly, but Morrison's arrest and the resolution of the immediate security crisis meant I had to start considering my professional future. Deep cover operations require agents whose identities haven't been compromised, whose faces aren't known to criminal networks, whose family connections can't be used as leverage against them. There are other specialties within the Bureau: white-collar crime, organized crime, counterterrorism. I could also move into supervisory roles, training other agents for undercover operations. But none of those would be the same as what you've been doing. No, trafficking work has been my specialty for 3 years. It's what I'm good at, and it's work that feels directly connected to protecting people who need protection. I'm sorry that got taken away from you because of what happened to Emma and me. It wasn't taken away because of you. It was taken away because a corrupt police officer decided to sell information to criminals. You and Emma were victims of his choices, not the cause of my career complications. Sunday morning, Martinez called to tell me that Morrison's cooperation had resulted in significant breakthroughs in the investigation. He had provided detailed information about El Doctor's organization, including the identities of other law enforcement personnel who had been compromised and the locations of trafficking operations in multiple cities. We're looking at the largest multi-jurisdictional trafficking bust in Bureau history, Martinez said. Morrison's information has given us enough probable cause for search warrants and arrests in Seattle, Portland, San Francisco, and Los Angeles. We're coordinating with local law enforcement agencies that haven't been compromised to execute simultaneous operations next week. What's my role in the operations? You'll be involved in the prosecutorial phase, helping prepare victim testimony, and working with federal prosecutors to build cases that will result in maximum sentences for the criminals we arrest. But your undercover days are over, at least for trafficking cases. It was both a relief and a loss. Relief because the constant stress of maintaining false identities while navigating life and death situations had been exhausting, and because the security breach had made it clear that the personal cost of the work was higher than I'd realized. But also a loss, because trafficking work had given me a sense of purpose and direct impact that I wasn't sure I could find in other specialties. Part 8. The following Tuesday, I was cleared to return to my apartment in Capitol Hill, though with security protocols that would remain in place indefinitely. My building had been swept for surveillance devices, my communications were being monitored by federal agents rather than criminals, and I had emergency procedures in place if anyone attempted to approach me with questions about my work or my family. Walking back into my apartment felt strange after 2 weeks in the safe house. The space looked exactly as I'd left it, but my relationship to it had changed fundamentally. This was no longer the apartment where Rachel, the disappointing daughter, lived while maintaining vague explanations about her employment. This was the apartment where Special Agent Chen lived while working federal trafficking cases. The distinction mattered more than I'd expected. For 3 years, I'd maintained careful separation between my professional identity and my personal life, protecting both my family and my undercover operations by keeping them completely compartmentalized. Now, those worlds had collided in ways that made that separation impossible to maintain. I unpacked my emergency kit and made coffee, then sat at my small kitchen table and called Emma to let her know I was back in my regular apartment. "How does it feel to be home?" she asked. "Different. Everything looks the same, but it feels like a different person's apartment now." "Because you're not hiding anymore?" "Because I can't hide anymore. There's no going back to the way things were before, when I could keep my work completely separate from my family relationships." Is that a good thing or a bad thing? It was a question I'd been asking myself since Morrison's arrest had resolved the immediate security crisis. The forced revelation of my career had eliminated the ongoing stress of maintaining elaborate deceptions with people I loved, but it had also created new complications about how to navigate family relationships when my work involved risks and responsibilities that most people couldn't understand. "It's complicated," I said. which seemed to be my default response to questions about the intersection of my professional and personal lives. Wednesday morning, I returned to the FBI field office for the first time since the security breach had forced me into protective custody. The building looked the same, but my status within it had changed significantly. I was no longer an active undercover agent working trafficking cases. I was now a compromised agent transitioning to new responsibilities, while helping with the prosecution phase of cases I'd helped develop. Martinez met me at security and walked me to his office, updating me on the progress of the multi-jurisdictional operations that Morrison's information had made possible. Simultaneous raids in 4 cities yesterday resulted in 37 arrests, he said as we walked through hallways filled with agents I'd worked with for years, but had never been able to discuss my cases with openly. We recovered 23 victims, including 8 children under the age of 16. El Doctor was arrested in Los Angeles, along with 6 other high-level organizers. The numbers were significant, representing the dismantling of a trafficking network that had operated across multiple states for years. But I also knew that numbers only told part of the story. 23 recovered victims meant 23 people who would need extensive support to recover from trauma and rebuild their lives. 8 children meant 8 young people who would need specialized care to process experiences that no child should have to survive. What's the timeline for prosecutions? Federal prosecutors in all 4 jurisdictions are coordinating to ensure maximum sentences for everyone involved. Your testimony will be crucial for establishing the scope of the network and the connections between operations in different cities. We spent the morning in meetings with prosecutors and other agents, reviewing evidence and planning the legal strategy that would result in convictions for trafficking, racketeering, and corruption charges. It was detailed, methodical work that required careful attention to legal procedures and evidentiary standards, but it was also deeply satisfying in ways that reminded me why I'd chosen law enforcement as a career. Thursday afternoon, I had my first meeting with the Victim Services Coordinator, who would be working with survivors from the recent raids. Maria, Anna, and Sophia were among the victims who had been recovered, along with 20 other people whose lives had been controlled by the network we'd dismantled. They're asking for you specifically, the coordinator told me. They want to know if Sarah is coming to help them prepare for the trials. This was going to be one of the most difficult aspects of transitioning away from undercover work. The victims I'd helped rescue knew me as Sarah Collins, the cleaning woman who had shown them kindness and promised that help would come. They didn't know that Sarah had been a fiction, that the person they trusted was actually a federal agent who had been gathering evidence while building relationships with them. How much do they know about my real identity? We've explained that you're a federal agent who was working undercover to help build cases against the people who hurt them. But they're still asking for Sarah, still thinking about you as the person who helped them when they were in captivity. What do they need from me now? Mostly reassurance that the legal process will result in justice for what they experienced, and that they'll be safe while the prosecutions move forward. They trust you in ways that they don't trust other law enforcement officials, even though they understand that you were never really Sarah. I spent the next several hours meeting individually with victims from the recent raids, helping them understand the legal process while reassuring them that their safety was the highest priority. For everyone involved in the prosecutions, it was emotionally demanding work, but it was also a reminder of why trafficking cases mattered so much and why the personal cost of undercover work had been worth it. Maria, who was now 16 and had been in protective custody for over a month, looked healthier than she had during our first meeting, but still carried herself with the wariness of someone who had learned not to trust easily. "Are you still going to help us?" she asked during our conversation. "Even though you're not Sarah anymore?" "I was always going to help you," I said. "Being Sarah was just a way to gather evidence that would help put the people who hurt you in prison. But the promise I made to you, the commitment to help you get justice and build a safe life, that was never part of the pretense. What happens now?" Now we make sure that everyone who participated in hurting you faces consequences for what they did. And we make sure that you have everything you need to recover from what you experienced and build the kind of life you want to have. Friday morning, Emma called to tell me that she'd finally talked to Mom about my career revelation and the security situation that had disrupted their lives for the past few weeks. How did she take it? I asked, though I wasn't sure I was prepared for the answer. Better than I expected, actually. I think she's been so worried about the security protocols and the federal agents and all the things she didn't understand that finding out you're actually successful at something important came as a relief. Did she say anything about the engagement party? About the things she said about my career? She asked me to tell you that she's proud of you and that she's sorry she didn't understand what you were accomplishing. She wants to talk to you directly, but she's not sure how to apologize for years of treating your work like it wasn't important. It was more than I'd expected, honestly. Mom had built her identity around social status and conventional success for so long that I hadn't been sure she could process the value of work that required secrecy and involved significant personal risk. The fact that she was acknowledging the importance of what I'd been doing, even if she couldn't fully understand it, felt like progress. Tell her I'll call her this weekend, and tell her that I understand why she reacted the way she did to my vague explanations about work. I understand that it looked like I was avoiding responsibility rather than protecting people. She also wants to know if you'll be able to come to Sunday dinner this week. David's parents are coming back into town, and she wants them to meet the federal agent, not the unemployed daughter. I laughed, despite myself. Even in the midst of processing the reality of my career, Mom was still thinking about social presentations and family image management. But there was something touching about her desire to introduce me as someone she could be proud of, even if it had taken a security crisis for her to understand that I'd been doing meaningful work all along. Tell her I'll be there, I said, and tell her she can introduce me however she wants. Part 9. Sunday dinner at Emma's apartment was different from any family gathering I'd attended in years. For the first time since I'd started working undercover operations, I didn't have to maintain careful conversational boundaries or deflect questions about my work. I didn't have to worry about accidentally revealing information that could compromise investigations or put victims at risk. David's parents, Margaret and James, were successful professionals who had initially been somewhat skeptical about Emma's family background. They'd met Mom and been impressed by her social connections and her involvement in various charitable organizations, but they'd also heard about the other daughter, the one who seemed to struggle with career stability and didn't contribute much to family gatherings. Now, they were meeting Special Agent Rachel Chen, and their reaction was everything Mom could have hoped for in terms of social validation and family pride. Emma tells us you work for the FBI, Margaret said during cocktails, her voice carrying the kind of respect that came from recognizing the significance of federal law enforcement. Work. That must be incredibly challenging and rewarding. It is, I said, still adjusting to being able to discuss my career openly, even in general terms. I specialize in human trafficking investigations, which involves working with victims and building cases against the criminal networks that exploit them. How do you handle the emotional aspects of that kind of work? James asked. It must be difficult to see what people are capable of doing to other human beings. It was an intelligent question, one that showed he understood that trafficking cases involved more than just law enforcement procedures. It was also a question that I'd never been able to discuss with family members who didn't know what I actually did for a living. The emotional cost is significant, I admitted, but the work also provides a sense of purpose and direct impact that makes it worthwhile. When operations succeed, when victims are rescued and criminals are convicted, it feels like the kind of work that justifies the personal sacrifices it requires. Mom had been unusually quiet during the conversation, but I could see her absorbing the respect that David's parents were showing for my career. This was what she'd wanted for years. A daughter whose work could be discussed openly at social gatherings, whose professional accomplishments reflected well on the family, whose choices could be presented as evidence of good parenting and strong family values. Rachel recently helped coordinate a major operation that resulted in dozens of arrests and the rescue of over 20 victims, Emma said, clearly proud to be able to share information about my work for the first time. It's been covered in the news, though obviously Rachel's role isn't public because of the undercover nature of the investigation. That's remarkable, Margaret said. It must be gratifying to know that your work has such a direct impact on protecting vulnerable people. As the evening progressed, I found myself relaxing into conversations about my career in ways that I hadn't been able to do for years. I could discuss the challenges of working with trauma survivors, the complexities of building legal cases that would result in convictions, the satisfaction of knowing that criminal networks had been dismantled and couldn't hurt additional victims. But I was also aware that this new openness came with a cost. The security breach that had forced the revelation of my identity had also ended my ability to work undercover trafficking cases. The career that David's parents were praising, the work that was finally earning Mom's respect, was work that I might not be able to continue in the same way. After dinner, Emma and I stepped onto her balcony while David and his parents continued talking with Mom about her charitable work and social connections. "How does it feel to be able to talk about your work openly?" Emma asked. "Strange. Good. But strange. I've spent so many years carefully controlling what I said about my job that it feels almost reckless to discuss it honestly. Are you going to miss the undercover work?" It was a question I'd been avoiding thinking about directly, but Emma's direct approach to difficult topics meant I couldn't deflect indefinitely. Yes and no. I'll miss the direct impact that comes from being in the field, from building relationships with victims and gathering evidence firsthand. But I won't miss the isolation, the constant deception, the strain of maintaining false identities while trying to maintain real relationships with family. The next morning, I had my first meeting with my new supervisor, Assistant Director Patricia Reeves, who would be overseeing my transition from undercover operations to a supervisory role within the trafficking division. Her office overlooked Elliott Bay, and she gestured for me to sit in one of the leather chairs across from her desk. Director Reeves was a 20-year veteran of the Bureau who had built her career on organized crime cases before moving into administrative roles. She was known for her direct communication style and her commitment to supporting agents who had made significant sacrifices for their work. "Agent Chen, your undercover work over the past 3 years has been exceptional. The networks you've helped dismantle, the victims you've rescued, the prosecutions you've enabled. It represents some of the most successful trafficking investigations in Bureau history." "Thank you, ma'am. But your cover identity has been compromised in ways that make it impossible for you to continue undercover operations safely. We need to discuss your options for moving forward." She outlined 3 possibilities for my career trajectory. I could transfer to white-collar crime investigations, where my analytical skills and attention to detail would be valuable for building complex financial cases. I could move to counterterrorism, where undercover work was less common and my experience with criminal networks would be relevant. Or I could transition to a supervisory role within the trafficking division, training and managing other agents while continuing to work prosecution support for cases I'd helped develop. "What appeals to you most?" she asked after explaining each option. "The supervisory role. I want to stay connected to trafficking work, even if I can't be in the field the same way. And I think my experience could be valuable for training agents who are just starting undercover operations." "That's what I was hoping you'd say. We need someone with your experience to develop training protocols for deep cover trafficking investigations. You've learned lessons over the past 3 years that could help other agents be more effective and safer in similar operations." Over the following weeks, I began transitioning into my new role while continuing to work with prosecutors on the cases that had emerged from Morrison's information and the multi-jurisdictional raids. It was intellectually engaging work that, allowed me to see the broader impact of individual investigations, but it was also a significant adjustment from the intensity and immediacy of undercover operations. I was reviewing training materials in my new office when Martinez knocked on the door. He'd been promoted to lead the trafficking division's field operations, taking over many of the responsibilities I'd handled as an undercover agent. "How's the transition going?" he asked, settling into the chair across from my desk. "It's different. I miss the direct victim contact, but I'm starting to see the value of being able to work multiple cases simultaneously rather than being embedded in one operation for months at a time. Any regrets about leaving undercover work?" "Some, but also relief. The security breach made it clear that the personal cost was higher than I'd realized. Having my family targeted because of my work was a wake-up call about the risks I'd been accepting without fully considering the implications." "How are things with your family now that they know the truth about your career?" It was a question I'd been thinking about frequently as I adjusted to my new role and my new relationship with family members who finally understood what I'd been doing for the past 3 years. Better in some ways, more complicated in others. My mother has gone from treating me like a disappointment to bragging about my career to anyone who will listen. Emma is relieved to finally understand why I was so secretive, but she's also worried about the dangers I face in law enforcement work. "And how do you feel about the change in family dynamics?" "Grateful that I don't have to maintain deceptions with people I love anymore, but also aware that their new understanding of my work comes with expectations and concerns that I'm still learning to navigate." 2 months into my new role, I received a call that would test everything I'd learned about balancing professional responsibilities with family relationships. Maria, the trafficking survivor I'd helped rescue during my final undercover operation, was scheduled to testify in the federal trial of El Doctor and his associates. She was asking specifically for me to be present during her testimony, not as an investigator, but as someone she trusted to help her get through the most difficult part of the legal process. The trial was being held in Los Angeles, where El Doctor had been arrested during the coordinated raids that followed Morrison's cooperation. It would be my first time traveling for work since the security breach, and my first time interacting with trafficking victims in my official capacity rather than as an undercover agent. I flew to Los Angeles on a Tuesday morning, carrying files and evidence that would support the prosecution's case, while also carrying the emotional weight of representing stability and safety for young people who had survived unimaginable trauma. Maria met me at the federal courthouse, accompanied by victim services personnel who had been working with her for months to prepare for this moment. She looked older than her 17 years, but also stronger than she had during our first interview in Seattle. "Agent Chen," she said, and I noticed that she used my real name rather than calling me Sarah. "Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure I could do this without someone here who understands what happened to us. You're incredibly brave for being willing to testify. Your testimony is going to help make sure that El Doctor and his associates can never hurt anyone else the way they hurt you." We spent an hour reviewing her testimony, going over the questions that prosecutors would ask, and preparing her for the aggressive cross-examination that defense attorneys would use to try to discredit her account. It was delicate work that required balancing legal preparation with emotional support for someone who was still recovering from severe trauma. The courtroom was packed when Maria took the witness stand. El Doctor sat at the defense table with his attorneys, looking smaller and less intimidating than he had probably seemed to the victims he'd controlled. But I could see Maria's hands shaking as she was sworn in, and I positioned myself where she could see me clearly if she needed reassurance during difficult moments. For 2 hours, Maria testified about her experiences with the trafficking network. She described being recruited with false promises of legitimate work, being transported across state lines and held against her will, being forced to work in conditions that constituted modern slavery. She talked about the fear that had controlled every aspect of her life for over a year, and about the hope that had sustained her when she met someone who promised that rescue was possible. When the prosecutor asked her to identify the person who had given her that hope, Maria looked directly at me. "Agent Chen," she said clearly, She was working undercover, using the name Sarah Collins, and she was the first person in months who treated me like a human being instead of property. The defense attorney's cross-examination was brutal, as expected. He questioned Maria's memory, suggested that her testimony might be colored by gratitude toward law enforcement officials, implied that she might be exaggerating her experiences to gain sympathy from the jury. But Maria remained calm and consistent, answering every question with the dignity of someone who had survived something terrible and was determined to see justice done. When she finished testifying, Maria was visibly exhausted, but also relieved. She had done something incredibly difficult, and she had done it well. The prosecution team was confident that her testimony, combined with the evidence we'd gathered during the undercover operation, would result in convictions for everyone involved in the trafficking network. That evening, I had dinner with Maria and her victim services advocate at a quiet restaurant near the courthouse. It was the first time we'd been able to have a normal conversation, without the pressure of legal proceedings or the artificial constraints of undercover work. "What happens next for you?" I asked. "I'm going to finish high school," she said. "Then maybe college. I want to study social work, help other people who have been through experiences like mine." "That sounds like meaningful work." "I learned from you that meaningful work sometimes requires personal sacrifice, but it's worth it when you know you're helping people who need help." Flying back to Seattle the next day, I reflected on how much had changed since the security breach had forced me out of undercover work. I was no longer Sarah Collins, the cleaning woman who built relationships with trafficking victims while gathering evidence against their captors. But I was still someone who could help survivors navigate the legal system, still someone who could train other agents to do the work I'd been doing, still someone whose career was making a difference in the fight against human trafficking. The plane descended through the familiar cloud cover that marked Seattle's airspace, and I could see the city spread out below me like a map of my complicated relationship with home and family and professional identity. For 3 years, I'd lived in Seattle while pretending to be someone else in my professional life. Now I could live here as myself, doing work that I could discuss openly with people I loved. Emma picked me up at the airport, and during the drive back to my apartment, she asked about the trial and Maria's testimony. How did it feel to help her get through something so difficult? Important. Different from undercover work, but still directly connected to helping trafficking survivors get justice and build new lives. Are you happy with your new role? It was a question I'd been asking myself frequently as I adjusted to supervising other agents rather than working cases directly. The work was meaningful and necessary, but it was also less immediate than undercover operations had been. I'm satisfied with it. It's work that matters, work that allows me to stay connected to trafficking investigations while also having a more normal relationship with family. It's a good balance. And how are things with Mom now that she understands what you've been doing? Better. She called me twice while I was in Los Angeles to check on how the trial was going. She's genuinely interested in my work now, instead of just worried about my lack of conventional career success. She's proud of you. She's been telling everyone. She knows about her daughter who works for the FBI. It was amusing to imagine Mom networking at her social events while casually mentioning that her daughter was a federal agent specializing in human trafficking investigations. After years of being positioned as the family disappointment, I was now being positioned as the family success story. But beneath the amusement was genuine appreciation for the fact that my family finally understood and valued what I'd been doing with my professional life. The forced revelation of my career had eliminated years of misunderstanding and created space for more honest relationships with people I loved. Sunday dinner at Emma's had become a regular tradition since David's parents had been so impressed with meeting a federal agent. This week, Mom brought articles she'd printed from news websites about federal trafficking investigations, wanting to discuss whether I'd been involved in cases that had received media coverage. "I saw this story about a big operation in California," she said, showing me a newspaper clipping. "Were you part of this investigation?" I can't discuss specifics about ongoing cases, but I can tell you that trafficking investigations often involve coordination between multiple agencies and jurisdictions. It says here that dozens of people were arrested and over 20 victims were rescued. That must be incredibly satisfying work. It is. Even when individual cases are difficult, knowing that criminal networks have been dismantled and victims have been helped makes the personal cost worthwhile. Personal cost? The emotional impact of working with trauma survivors, the security risks that come with targeting dangerous criminals, the lifestyle restrictions that are necessary for maintaining operational security. Mom listened carefully as I explained the realities of federal law enforcement work, asking questions that showed she was genuinely trying to understand both the importance of what I did and the sacrifices it required. It was the kind of conversation we'd never been able to have when I was maintaining cover stories about my employment. "I'm sorry I didn't understand before," she said as we were clearing dishes after dinner. "I'm sorry I made assumptions about your career choices without knowing what you were actually accomplishing. You couldn't have understood without information I wasn't able to share. I don't blame you for reacting to what you could see rather than what I couldn't tell you. But I should have trusted that you were making good choices, even when I couldn't understand what those choices were." Later that evening, Emma and I sat on her couch with glasses of wine, reflecting on how much our family dynamics had changed since the security breach had forced the revelation of my career. "Do you think you'll stay in law enforcement long term?" Emma asked. "Probably. It's work that feels important, and I've built expertise that would be difficult to transfer to other fields. But I might eventually move into policy work or academia, teaching about trafficking investigations rather than conducting them directly. What would you want people to know about the work you've been doing?" It was a question that got to the heart of why I'd chosen law enforcement as a career and why I'd been willing to accept the personal costs that came with undercover operations. I'd want them to know that trafficking isn't something that happens in other countries to other people. It's happening in every major city in the United States, to American citizens and foreign nationals, to adults and children. And I'd want them to know that law enforcement responses can be effective when they're properly funded and strategically coordinated. Anything else? That the survivors are remarkable people who have endured unimaginable experiences and still found the courage to help build cases against the people who hurt them. Working with trafficking victims has been the most inspiring aspect of my career, even when it's also been the most emotionally difficult. 3 months later, I was preparing training materials for a new class of FBI agents who would be specializing in trafficking investigations when Martinez knocked on my office door with news that would bring my story full circle. "Chen, I thought you'd want to know. Morrison's cooperation has resulted in the identification of trafficking networks in 6 additional cities. We're looking at the largest federal trafficking prosecution in Bureau history, with over 200 defendants and more than 50 rescued victims. What's the timeline for prosecutions?" "Preliminary hearings start next month, and trials will probably continue for the next 2 years. We're going to need your help coordinating victim services and witness preparation. I'll be there." As Martinez left my office, I thought about the path that had brought me from the engagement party where Mom had called me worthless to this moment, where I was being asked to help coordinate the largest trafficking prosecution in federal history. The journey had required personal sacrifices that I was still processing, but it had also resulted in work that would protect countless potential victims and provide justice for survivors of terrible crimes. I pulled out my phone and called Emma to let her know that I'd be traveling frequently over the next few months for the prosecution phase of the trafficking cases. "Will you be safe?" she asked, the same question she'd been asking since learning about the realities of my career. As safe as anyone can be when working federal law enforcement cases. The immediate security threats have been resolved, and I'm not doing undercover work anymore. Good. Mom would never forgive me if something happened to her FBI agent daughter. After we hung up, I returned to preparing training materials for agents who would be doing the work I'd done for 3 years. It was satisfying work that allowed me to pass on knowledge that had been gained through experience, mistakes, and successes in some of the most challenging investigations the Bureau conducted. But it was also work that reminded me daily of the victims who had trusted me with their stories, the survivors who had found the courage to testify against their captors, and the criminals who were now serving prison sentences because law enforcement officers had been willing to disappear into false identities for months or years at a time. That evening, I walked through my Capitol Hill neighborhood and reflected on how much my life had changed since the security breach had forced me to give up undercover work. I no longer had to maintain elaborate deceptions about my employment, no longer had to deflect questions from family members about my career choices, no longer had to live with the constant stress of protecting cover identities that could be blown by a single mistake. But I also no longer had the immediate impact that came from working directly with trafficking victims, no longer had the satisfaction of gathering evidence firsthand that would result in the rescue of people who had been enslaved, no longer had the intense focus that came from dedicating months of my life to single investigations. The trade-offs were complex, but they were also necessary. My family understood and valued my work for the first time in years. I could build relationships without maintaining professional deceptions. I could contribute to trafficking investigations, while also having a personal life that didn't require constant compartmentalization. As I reached my apartment building, I thought about Maria and the other survivors I'd worked with over the years. They were building new lives, pursuing education and careers and relationships that had been impossible while they were being trafficked. Their recovery was ongoing and would probably continue for years, but they were free and safe and supported by people who understood what they'd survived. That was the real measure of success in trafficking investigations. Not the number of arrests or the length of sentences, but the number of people who were no longer being exploited, who had been given the opportunity to determine their own futures, who had received justice for what they'd experienced. I unlocked my apartment door and stepped into the space that had once felt like a temporary refuge between undercover operations. Now it felt like home, a place where I could be myself without maintaining professional deceptions, where I could build a life that integrated my commitment to law enforcement work with my relationships with family and friends. My phone buzzed with a text from Mom. Saw another article about federal trafficking investigations. Proud of the work you're doing. See you Sunday. For years, I'd carried the weight of being misunderstood by people who loved me but couldn't see the value in work I couldn't explain. Now I carried the satisfaction of being known and appreciated for contributions that could finally be acknowledged, even if they couldn't be discussed in detail. The badge in my purse had always represented my commitment to protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. Now it also represented the resolution of years of family misunderstanding, the validation of choices that had seemed inexplicable to people who only saw their surface appearance. I made coffee and sat at my kitchen table, reviewing files for the training program I would be conducting the following week. New agents who were preparing for their first undercover assignments, people who would soon learn the personal cost and professional satisfaction of disappearing into false identities in service of justice. They would face the same challenges I'd faced, maintaining deceptions with people they cared about, living with the emotional weight of victims' stories, accepting security risks that extended to family members who had no choice in the matter. But they would also experience the profound satisfaction of work that made a direct difference in the fight against one of humanity's oldest and most persistent crimes. As I prepared their training materials, I thought about the advice I would give them about balancing professional responsibilities with personal relationships, about the importance of maintaining some connection to their real identities, even while living as someone else, about the ways that meaningful work sometimes requires personal sacrifices, but also provides rewards that make those sacrifices worthwhile. The story that had begun with my mother calling me worthless at my sister's engagement party had evolved into something more complex and ultimately more hopeful. A story about the difference between being seen and being understood, about the value of work that can't always be celebrated publicly, about the possibility of building a life that integrates professional purpose with personal relationships. I closed the training files and prepared for bed, thinking about the survivors who were building new lives, the agents who would continue the work I'd been doing, and the family members who finally understood why I'd chosen a career that required so much secrecy and personal sacrifice. The badge would always be there, representing my commitment to justice and my connection to work that mattered. But it no longer represented the distance between who I really was and who my family thought I was. Now it represented the bridge between professional purpose and personal relationships, between the work that defined my days and the people who made my life meaningful. Tomorrow would bring new cases, new agents to train, new opportunities to contribute to investigations that would protect vulnerable people and hold criminals accountable for their crimes. It would also bring family dinners where I could discuss my work openly, relationships that no longer required careful deception, and the satisfaction of being known and valued for who I really was rather than who I appeared to be. The transformation. From disappointment to pride, from misunderstanding to recognition, from secrecy to openness, represented more than just a change in family dynamics. It represented the possibility of building a life where professional purpose and personal relationships could coexist, where meaningful work could be celebrated rather than hidden, where the people you love could finally see and appreciate the person you'd always been. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.